The bench had been empty for 6 hours when the first car pulled up to the curb, and the man who stepped out of it owned more buildings than there were lights on that whole stretch of Halstead Avenue. He stood there in a coach that cost more than Renee made in a month, looking at the slats of weathered green wood as if they were the most important thing in the city. And he did not know her name yet. He did not know that for 2 years she had walked to that bench every night after the diner closed and left a paper bag on the same end of it, folded twice at the top, the way you fold a bag for someone you respect. He did not know she had no idea who she had been feeding. Neither did she. That was the whole shape of it. The thing the listener can already feel coming and the woman at the center could not. Two people circling a kindness from opposite ends of a city, one of them about to learn what it had been holding up the entire time. Renee Carter was 36 years old, and she had been tired for most of them. She worked the closing shift at a diner called the Blue Hour, a narrow box of a place wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered shoe repair on the south end of the avenue, and she had worked there for 9 years. Long enough that the regulars ordered by nodding, and the owner trusted her with the keys. She had a daughter named Joy who was 11 and slept in the only bedroom while Renee took the pull-out couch, and she had a rent that went up every spring and a paycheck that did not, and she carried all of it the way she carried a full tray, balanced, steady, refusing to let it tip even when her arms shook. She did not think of herself as a generous person. She thought of herself as a woman trying to keep 2 people fed and warm in an apartment where the radiator knocked all night, and that was the truth. But it was not the whole truth, because the whole truth included the bench. The man on the bench was named Walter, though for a long time Renee did not know that either. He had appeared on the avenue in the late fall 2 years before, the way people sometimes appeared without explanation or warning, a tall thin shape in a brown corduroy jacket who took up residence on the green bench across from the diner and did not bother anyone. He kept his hands in his lap. He watched the street with a steadiness that unsettled some of the other regulars, who muttered that he was probably trouble, probably an addict, probably something to be careful of. Renee did not think he was trouble. She thought he was hungry because she had spent enough years near hunger to recognize the particular stillness of a person who is rationing his own movement to spend less of himself. And the first night she noticed it, she did a thing she would later be unable to fully explain. She wrapped the last grilled cheese off the grill, the one that would have gone in the trash at close, and she carried it across the street and set it on the end of the bench, and she said good night, and she went home. She did not expect to do it again. The next night, though, the cold had teeth in it, and she found herself wrapping a bowl of soup in a way that would not spill, and after that, it simply became the shape of her evenings, the last thing she did before she walked to her bus. A bag on the bench, folded twice, at the top. Sometimes a grilled cheese, sometimes soup, sometimes the meatloaf special that had not sold. Once a slice of the lemon cake that Joy loved when there was a piece left over, and Renee thought a man on a bench in January deserved something sweet as much as anyone. She never made a show of it. She never waited to watch him eat. She set the bag down, she said goodnight, and the man named Walter would lift his hand from his lap in a small, grave gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a blessing, and she would walk on. Here is a thing worth sitting with for a moment, and then we will go on. The kindnesses that change everything are almost never the ones we plan. They are the ones that become a habit so quietly we forget we are doing them. Renee never once thought of that bag as charity. She thought of it as cleanup, as the natural end of a shift, the way you wipe a counter without deciding to. Hold on to that, because it matters more than she could have known. The money was always tight, and that winter it got tighter. Joy needed a coat. A real one, because the one from last year stopped at her wrists now, and the cold came up the avenue off the lake like it had a grudge. Renee found a coat at the resale shop for $22, a navy parka with a hood lined in fake fur, and she put it on layaway and paid it down $4 at a time. She remembered each of those payments the way you remember small humiliations and small victories that turn out to be the same thing, $4 on a Thursday, $4 on the next. The woman at the counter setting the coat back on its hook each time with a patience Renee was grateful for and a little ashamed of. The night she finally brought it home, Joy wore it to bed over her pajamas and would not take it off, and lay there grinning up at the ceiling with the hood cinched around her face, and Renee stood in the doorway and watched her daughter fall asleep warm and thought that $22 had never bought anything finer. There were nights that month Renee skipped her own dinner so the math would come out, ate a single slice of diner toast standing up at the counter and called it supper, and walked home on it. She told no one. She did not see it as a sacrifice. She saw it as arithmetic, and she was good at arithmetic, and the bag still went on the bench every night because cutting that would have felt like cutting something she could not name, some thread that, once pulled, would unravel more than a meal. The diner's owner was a man named Curtis, 61, heavy-set and slow-moving and kinder than he let on, who had bought the Blue Hour from his own father and kept it open, mostly out of stubbornness. He saw Renee make up the bag most nights, and for a long time he said nothing. And then, one February evening, he stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her fold the top of a bag twice, and he said, "You know you don't have to do that, Renee. The food's spoiled, it's coming out of the count either way." And Renee said she knew, and Curtis said, "Then why?" And she stood there a second with a bag in her hands, and she said, "Because if it was me out there, I'd want to know somebody saw me." Curtis didn't say anything to that. He turned the grill off. The next week, though, the portions on the unsold specials got a little larger, and neither of them mentioned it, and that was the closest Curtis ever came to telling her he was proud. What Renee did not know, what nobody on that avenue knew, was who Walter had been before the bench. She had built a quiet story about him, the way we all build stories about strangers, and her story was gentle, a man who had fallen on hard luck, a man the world had let slip through. The truth was both simpler and stranger than that. Walter had not slipped through anything. Walter had stepped off, on purpose with his eyes open, and the bench was not where his life had collapsed, but where he had gone to watch it from a distance and decide whether any of it had been worth a thing. He had reasons. They were good reasons and they were terrible ones, and they had everything to do with a name on the side of a great many buildings in that city, and we will come to all of it, but first you should understand the winter, because the winter was when the thing that mattered actually happened, slowly, a bag at a time. By March, Walter had begun to talk to her. Not much. A man on a bench does not become a conversationalist overnight, and Walter had spent a long time inside his own silence, but the bags had worn a small door in him, and one night when Renee set down a container of chicken and rice, he said, "You have a daughter." It was not a question. Renee stopped. She had never mentioned Joy, and Walter tipped his head toward the diner window, where on the slow nights Joy sometimes sat in the back booth doing her homework under the buzzing light while she waited for her mother to close, a small girl in a navy parka she refused to remove, indoors. Renee said, "Yes, Joy, 11. And Walter looked at the window a while longer and said, "She does her letters very carefully. I can see it from here." And Renee, who had spent that very week worrying that Joy was falling behind in school, felt something in her chest come loose, because it had been a long time since anyone had told her something good about her child without wanting anything back. They talked more after that in the small, economical way of two people who both knew the cold. Walter asked nothing of her and offered nothing about himself, and Renee learned not to push, because the one time she asked him where his people were, he went quiet for so long she thought she had broken something, and she did not ask again. He liked the lemon cake, and the night she brought it he held the slice a moment before he ate it and said it had been a long time since anyone gave him something sweet. And Renee said everybody deserved something sweet in January, and Walter looked at her like she had said something far larger than she meant. He could name every bird that came to the bare tree by the bus stop, and he taught Joy 3 of them through the window one evening, using his hands against the glass, a quick flick for the sparrow, a flat slow sweep for the starling, and the fat grey pigeon that Joy named Gerald and adopted as a personal friend and reported on nightly thereafter. Whether Gerald had come, whether Gerald looked cold, whether Gerald had found anything to eat. Walter took these reports with great seriousness. He had a way of going very still and watching the avenue that Renee came to understand was not menace at all, but a kind of attention, as if he were keeping a careful ledger of a world that had stopped keeping one of him, the man who shoveled his own walk and the woman who did not, the teenager who held the door and the one who let it swing, all of it noted. All of it weighed. She did not know what the ledger was. 4. She would find out, and when she found out, it would rearrange everything she thought she knew about the man on the bench. But that was still a winter and a spring away, and for now there was only the talk and the birds and the bag. Spring came late and mean that year, and with it came a stretch of nights that nearly broke her. The diner cut her hours because business was slow, 2 shifts a week, gone just like that, and Curtis apologized when he told her and looked like he would rather have taken a beating, and Renee told him it was all right because there was nothing else to say. The rent notice came with a new number on it, $40 higher, and the bus pass went up 8, and Joy's shoes split along the side where the little toe pushed through a clean grey line opening in the canvas that Renee tried to mend with a needle and thread and could not. She sat at the kitchen table one night after Joy was asleep, with the bills fanned out in front of her like a hand of cards. She could not win with the electric, the gas, the rent, the phone she kept, only because the school needed a number to reach her, and she did the arithmetic 4 times under the dim kitchen light, and 4 times it came out the same. Which was short. She was $80 short for the month, and there was nowhere left to cut. She had already cut herself. She had cut her own meals down to the bone and walked when she could have ridden and worn the same 2 work shirts until the collars frayed. She put her head down on the cool table and she did not cry, because crying felt like a luxury she could not afford either. And she stayed like that a while, with the hum of the old refrigerator filling the kitchen. After a while, she lifted her head and she made up the bag for the bench, because it was the one thing she could still do that asked nothing and gave something, and somehow, doing it, steadied her, where a person standing in a flood will still straighten a picture on the wall. She almost didn't, that night. She stood in the empty diner, with the bag in her hand, and a voice in her head said, "You cannot even feed yourself. You have no business feeding a stranger. Take it home, eat it, you earned it." And another voice, quieter, the one that sounded a little like her grandmother, said, "The day you start measuring kindness by what you can spare is the day you've already lost." So she carried the bag across the street and set it on the green bench and folded the top twice, and Walter lifted his hand from his lap, and she said, "Good night." And she meant it more than she had meant anything in weeks. There is a question I want to put to you here, gently, before we go on, because this is the kind of story that lives or dies on it. Have you ever kept doing a small good thing past the point where it made any sense, simply because stopping felt worse than the cost of continuing? If you have, then you already understand Renee, and you understand why the next part of this matters. So stay close, because the morning is coming. It came on a Tuesday. Renee got off the bus before dawn the way she did, the avenue grey and wet and not yet awake. And, out of habit, her eyes went to the bench across from the diner, and the bench was empty. That, in itself, was not strange. Walter was sometimes up early, walking the block to keep his blood moving, and the bag from the night before was usually gone, which meant he had eaten. This morning the bag was not gone. It sat on the end of the bench, exactly where she had left it, folded twice at the top, untouched, beaded with the night's drizzle, and the sight of it stopped her cold in the middle of the empty street. Walter had never once left the bag. In 2 years, never. She crossed to the bench and picked it up, and the food inside was cold and whole, and she stood there holding it with the rain starting again, and she understood with a sick certainty that something had changed. She asked everyone. She asked Curtis, who had not seen him and who came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, to stand in the doorway and look at the empty bench with her. She asked the man who opened the laundromat, who shrugged and said he kept his eyes on his machines. She asked the woman who ran the corner store, who pressed her lips together and said she hoped he was all right but had not seen him, and the early bus driver who slowed at the stop and rolled his window down when Renee flagged him and said no tall fellow in a brown jacket, not this week. None of them had seen the man, not that morning, not the night before, once Renee had gone home. She walked the block 3 times before her shift and twice after, the bag growing heavy and cold in her hand. She looked in the alley behind the shoe repair, where a man might shelter from the wind, and there was nothing there but a flattened box and a milk crate. She walked the 4 streets down to the overpass where she knew some folks slept and stood at the edge of it calling his name into the grey, echoing dark, Walter, Walter, and a couple of shapes stirred under their blankets, and one of them said there was no Walter here, lady, and she apologized and backed away. There was no sign of him anywhere, as if the avenue had simply closed over the place where he had been, the way water closes over a dropped stone. She left the bag on the bench again that night, in case. It was there in the morning, untouched, beaded with dew. She did this for 9 nights, a bag a night, each one untouched, each one a small white flag of hope going grey in the weather. And on the 10th morning she stood at the bench a long time with her hand resting on the cold wet wood where his hand used to rest, and then she took the bag back, because hope that goes unanswered long enough starts to feel like a thing you are doing to hurt yourself. And Renee had never had the luxury of hurting herself on purpose. She told herself the stories you tell yourself. He had moved on, found a shelter bed, gone to family, gotten on a bus to somewhere warmer. She told herself he was fine, and she did not believe it. And the not believing sat in her chest all that long spring like a stone she had swallowed. Joy asked about him. Joy asked where Walter went and whether Gerald the pigeon would miss him, and Renee did not have an answer that was both true and kind. So she said he had gone to be with people who loved him, and she hoped to God it was true, and she had no way to know. The hardest of those weeks deserves to be told plainly, because Renee told no one and carried all of it. The $80 she was short became a late fee, and the late fee became a second notice, and the second notice came with a date on it that Renee read standing in the diner's back hallway under the buzzing light, and then folded into quarters and put in her apron pocket where it pressed against her hip all night like a second heart beating out of time. She picked up a Saturday cleaning job at an office building downtown, 4 hours scrubbing toilets, and emptying bins in a tower of glass where the light stayed on all night for no one, and she rode the train down before dawn with the cleaning crew, none of them talking, all of them carrying the particular silence of people doing invisible work in a place built for people who would never see them. The money helped, and it was not enough. So she did the only thing left, which she had sworn she would never do. She took the small gold ring her mother had left her, the only thing of any value she owned, a thin, worn band her mother had worn, for 40 years through dishwater and fieldwork and the raising of 4 children, and she carried it 3 blocks to the pawn shop on the corner of Halstead and Marsh and set it on the counter under the man's lamp. He picked it up and turned it and breathed on it and rubbed it on his sleeve and turned it again, and Renee stood very straight and did not let her face do anything, and he named a number, $60, for a ring her mother had worn for 40 years. Renee said yes before her pride could say no, and she signed the slip, and she took the 320s, folded warm in her hand, and walked out into the spring light, feeling like she had sold off a piece of her own arm, feeling the bare place on her finger where the ring had been, and she told no one that either. She did the arithmetic on the train home, and for the first time in months it came out even, and she found she could not be glad about it. She did not stop leaving food, not really. The bench was empty, but the impulse was not, and she found herself doing smaller versions of it everywhere. The cleaning crew downtown, the new dishwasher at the diner who came in hungry, a woman at the bus stop with a baby and no bottle. She could not have told you why, except that stopping the one had not stopped the thing inside her the one had come from, and maybe that is the real inheritance of a habit like that, not the food, but the seeing, the refusal to look past a person who needs to be looked at. Curtis watched her do it and shook his head and said, "Renee, you can't save everybody." And Renee said she wasn't trying to save anybody, she was just trying not to walk past them, and there is a difference. And Curtis, who had known her 9 years, decided she was probably the best person he had ever employed and possibly the most stubborn, which in his book were the same thing. Was then summer came. The stone in her chest did not dissolve, but it settled, the way grief settles when you have nobody to bury and no certainty to grieve, into a low ache she stopped noticing, except late at night. The rent got paid barely, every month a fresh act of arithmetic and will. Joy grew an inch and outgrew the navy parka, which Renee folded into a bag for the resale shop and then could not bring herself to give away because the parka was tangled up with the winter, and the winter was tangled up with Walter and the bench, and some things you keep even when you cannot say what they are for. She kept the parka. She kept leaving the porch light of her attention on for a man who was not coming back, and the city went on around her, indifferent and enormous the way cities do. It was the second week of September when the letter came. Renee almost did not see it, because it came to the diner and not the apartment, addressed in a careful, blocky hand to Renee Carter, care of the Blue Hour Diner, and Curtis set it by the register where she found it at the start of her shift. There was no return address. The paper was good, heavier than the bill she was used to, and her name on the front was written by someone who had taken time over each letter, and she stood holding it a moment with a feeling she could not place, a kind of recognition that came before any understanding. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet, and clipped to the corner of it a small photograph, and when she unfolded the sheet and saw the first line, the whole noisy diner went away. The letter was from Walter, or it was about Walter, written in his hand but addressed from somewhere else, and what it said, in the plain, careful words of a man who had spent a long time choosing them, was this: that his name was Walter Ames. That, for the 2 years he sat on that bench, he had been a man taking the measure of his own life, having decided, after losses he did not detail, that he no longer believed there was any goodness left in people that was not bought or performed, that he had a great deal of money, more than he could spend, and that money had taught him to expect a price behind every kindness, and so he had gone to sit on a bench in plain old clothes in a part of the city where no one knew his face, to see whether anyone would treat a man who could give them nothing as if he were worth the trouble. He had not expected an answer. He wrote that he had nearly gotten his answer, the answer he feared, the empty one. Then on a cold night in the late fall, a tired woman from the diner across the street had set a grilled cheese on the end of the bench, folded the bag twice, said good night, and walked away without waiting for thanks. And she had done it again the next night, and every night after, for 2 years, never once asking who he was, never once waiting to be seen doing it. He wrote that she had given him back a thing he had stopped believing existed, and that he had said nothing because he had not wanted to spoil it, had not wanted to turn the one true kindness he had found into another transaction by revealing what he could give in return. Then the letter explained the morning he disappeared. He had collapsed on the bench late on a Monday night, his heart an ambulance called by a passing stranger, and he had spent the week since in a hospital bed and then in his own house with nurses, too weak to write, certain at first that he would not survive it. He wrote that in those weeks, drifting in and out, the thing his mind kept returning to was not his buildings or his accounts, but a paper bag folded twice at the top and a voice saying good night, and that he had understood, finally, what he had been trying to learn on that bench, that the goodness he had stopped believing in had been sitting across the street from him the whole time, closing a diner, raising a girl, folding a bag for a stranger she thought had nothing to give. He wrote that he was sorry to have vanished without a word and frightened her, for he had guessed she would worry, and that worrying about a stranger was simply more proof of who she was. The photograph clicked to the corner was old and a little creased. It showed a much younger Walter, upright and well, standing in front of a building Renee knew, a building she had cleaned, the very glass tower downtown where she scrubbed floors on Saturdays, with his name on a small brass plate by the door she had walked past a dozen times without reading. Immies. She sat down hard on the stool behind the register. Curtis came over and asked what was wrong, and she could not speak. She just turned the letter toward him, and Curtis read it standing up, and then sat down too, on a crate of ketchup, and the two of them sat in the closed diner in the morning light, not saying anything at all. There was a second page. Renee had not seen it folded behind the first. On the second page, Walter had written that he wanted to do something, and that he knew she was proud, and that he had thought hard about how to do it without insulting her, because a man who has just learned what dignity looks like does not want to be the one to take it away. So he had not sent her money, which he wrote she would have had every right to refuse. He had done something else. He owned the building her apartment was in. It turned out, or rather a company he owned, had bought it years ago among many others. And he had instructed that company to do 3 things. Her rent was fixed at its current amount for as long as she or Joy wished to live there, never to rise again. The back balance, the late fees, the second notice, all of it was cleared. And there was a fund set aside in Joy's name for her schooling, From the first grade she still had left through whatever college she could reach, already arranged, already real, requiring nothing of Renee but to let it be done. He wrote that this was not payment, because the thing she had given him could not be paid for, and that he hoped she would understand the difference. He signed it, "Your friend from the bench, Walter." Renee read the second page twice, and then she put both pages down on the counter very gently as if they might break, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, and the tears that came were not the kind she had been too proud or too tired to cry all spring. These were a different kind. Curtis got up off the ketchup crate and put a heavy hand on her shoulder and said, in a thick voice, "Well, well now." And outside the window the green bench sat empty, across the avenue in the September sun, and a fat grey pigeon, that might have been Gerald, walked the length of it and flew off. She did not tell Joy right away. She wanted to be steady first, and it took her a few days to be steady. Days in which she carried the letter folded in her apron the way she had once carried the eviction notice, except this paper did not press against her, like a second heart beating wrong. This paper felt like a hand laid flat over the place that had ached all spring. When she did tell Joy, she did it simply, the way Walter had done everything. Simply. She said their friend from the bench had been someone important after all, and that he had been all right. That he had been sick, but he was being cared for, and that he had remembered them, and that some things were going to be easier now. Joy, 11 and sharp, looked at her mother a long moment and asked the only question that mattered to her, which was whether Walter knew that Gerald was okay. And Renee laughed for the first time in months, a real laugh that surprised her, and said she would make sure he knew. She wrote him back. It took her 3 nights at the kitchen table to find the words, and in the end the letter she sent was short, because Walter had taught her that the truest things are said plainly. She thanked him, but not too much, because she sensed that too much thanks would embarrass him and undo the careful thing he had built. She told him about Joy and Gerald because she thought it would make him smile, and then she wrote the part she had been working toward for 3 nights, which was that she had not done it for a reward, and that she would have done it the same if he had been exactly the man she thought he was, a man with nothing, and that she hoped he knew the bag would have come every night either way. She wrote that she did not want him to think the kindness had been an investment that paid off, because that would make it smaller than it was. She wrote, "You did not owe me anything, and I did not lend you anything, and that is the whole point of it." She mailed it to the address his company had given her, and a week later a single line came back in the careful, blocky hand. It said, "I know. That is why." They met, finally, in the late fall, almost exactly a year after the morning the bench was empty. The address his company had given her turned out to be a tall stone house on a quiet street north of the park, with a nurse who answered the door and led her down a hall hung with photographs to a bright, quiet room at the back. Walter was thinner and walked with a cane now, and his colour was not good, but his eyes were the same steady eyes that had watched the avenue and named the birds. And when Renee came into the room where he sat by a window, he lifted his hand from the arm of his chair in that small, grave gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a blessing. And Renee's throat closed, and she had to stand a moment in the doorway before she trusted herself to cross the room. She had brought him a grilled cheese wrapped in a bag folded twice at the top, because she did not know what else to bring a man who had given her everything, and she felt foolish carrying it up the walk of that grand house, and then she saw his face when he understood what was in the bag, and she did not feel foolish anymore. Walter took it in both hands and laughed until he coughed, and the nurse moved to help him, and he waved her off, and he said it was the best gift he had received in years, and he meant it, and he ate half of it right there while it was still warm. Joy came too, and stood shy at first in the big room, and then when Walter asked after Gerald, with great seriousness, told him at length about the pigeon and the 3 birds he had taught her, and a 4th she had learned on her own, a cardinal, red as a stop sign, that came to the tree by the school. Walter listened with the full attention. He gave everything, leaning forward over his cane. And when Joy ran out of words, he told her she still did her letters very carefully. He could tell, and Joy beamed like he had handed her the sun. He lived another 11 months. They were good months, as those things go. Renee visited on her days off and brought food he did not need but loved receiving, and Joy did her homework in his bright room. Sometimes the way she had once done it in the back booth, and Walter, who had spent 2 years on a bench deciding whether the world held any goodness, spent his last year inside the proof of it. He told Renee once, near the end, that the worst thing money had ever done to him was teach him to be suspicious of love, and that a paper bag had undone in 2 winters what his whole fortune had spent a lifetime building. He asked her to keep doing it, the bench, the bag, for whoever sat there next. And she promised, and she kept the promise. There is a green bench on the south end of Halstead Avenue, and most nights after the blue hour closes, a bag appears on the end of it, folded twice at the top, and whoever finds it does not know who left it or why, and that is exactly how Renee wants it. When Walter died, his lawyer called her before it was in any paper, because Walter had asked him to, and Renee closed the diner an hour early that night and walked to the bench and sat on it for the first time, on the very end where the bags had always gone, and she watched the avenue the way he used to. And she understood for the first time what he had been doing all those nights, keeping a careful ledger of a world that had stopped keeping one of him, waiting to see if anyone would write him back into it. Somebody had. She sat there until the cold came up off the lake, and then she went home to her daughter in the apartment that was theirs now, truly theirs, the rent fixed forever and the fear gone out of the walls, and she made up a bag for the morning. Renee never spent the schooling fund on anything but Joy, who is in her 2nd year of college now, studying to be a teacher, because she said she wanted to be the kind of person who notices the child doing her letters carefully in the back of the room. The gold ring came home from the pawn shop the same week the letter came, redeemed quietly by a company Renee never had to thank, and it sits on her finger now, where her mother's hand had worn it thin. The navy parka she could never give away hangs in the closet still, 2 sizes too small for anyone in that house, and Renee keeps it because some things you keep, even when you cannot say what they are for, except that now she can say it. She kept it because of a winter and a bench and a man who taught her that the kindness you do when you think no one is watching is the only kind that was ever real, and that the world, slow and indifferent and enormous as it is, keeps a longer memory than it lets on. If you have ever set something down for a stranger and walked away without waiting to be thanked, I hope this finds you tonight and tells you it was not wasted. Nothing like that is ever wasted. And if you want to sit with one more story about the quiet good that comes back around when you least expect it, there is another one waiting, about a nurse who worked a double every Christmas Eve for 19 years and never once said why, and what was waiting for her the year she finally stopped.